訳アカデミーは1998年5月24日に名誉最高顧問の元英国首相マーガレット・サッチャー女史をお招きし、特別講演会を開催いたしました。ハローは1992年以来ほぼ毎年サッチャー女史をイギリスよりお招きし講演会を行っており、今回で6度目の講演会開催となります。政界を引退後も世界を舞台にして精力的に活躍し続けるサッチャー女史には、今回「私の人生」と題してご自身が育った環境や英国首相在任の時のエピソードなどについてお話ししていただきました。講演会場となった新高輪プリンスホテルの国際館パミールは、サッチャー女史の講演を心待ちにしていたハローの生徒や卒業生など約1800名の聴衆で埋め尽くされました。
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We would like to thank you very much for your presence here today at this special lecture by Lady Margaret Thatcher, an Honorary Advisor to Harold Guide Academy. My name is Yukiko Kuroda, and I'll be serving as the Master of Ceremonies for today's program. I would highly appreciate your cooperation for the proceedings of the program. When Lady Thatcher enters this hall, let us all give her a warm round of applause. Ladies and gentlemen, Lady Margaret Thatcher. We would like to commence today's program with a few words from Mr. Genichiro Ueyama, President of Harold Guide Academy.
Lady Thatcher, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and pleasure to welcome Lady Thatcher, our Honorary Advisor, to Harold Guide Academy. On behalf of the Academy, I would like to express our deepest gratitude to Lady Thatcher for her almost annual visits over the past 7 years. Her presence here is always greatly appreciated. This time, I have asked Lady Thatcher to speak to us about her own life. Although Lady Thatcher has already published 2 autobiographies, The Downing Street Years and The Path to Power, it has been my long-standing hope that Lady Thatcher would tell us more about her own life in her own words, I would be most grateful to hear how Lady Thatcher's early life experiences helped prepare her for the demanding political roles she would eventually assume. I sincerely hope that this lecture will be of special value for all of you here today who have or will have leading roles in international and intercultural exchanges. And now, I would like to present one of the greatest political leaders of this century, Lady Margaret Thatcher.
Mr. Ueyama, and all kind friends and members of the Hello Academy. I'm very much aware from my previous visits that you are Japan's largest training school for professional tour guides. I have looked forward to coming here each year for the last 7 years. And may I congratulate you on the training this school gives, which is evidenced by the welcome and the courtesy with which tourists and guests are received in Japan. That is evidence of the excellence and quality of your work. On this occasion, unusually, I'm asked to speak not on current affairs, not on the things that are affecting the world now, but how I came myself to become a political leader from a very ordinary origin, and some of the experiences I have learned of what influences international events during my time. Because, my friends, events don't just happen. They are caused by the leadership and the direction of leadership of individuals and governments, and in a free society of many, many people in leadership positions locally, in leadership positions in industry, and in leadership positions in the press. That is the difference between a dictatorship society, when everyone is told what to do, and a free society in which we get leadership at almost every kind of level. It was into such a very ordinary family that I was born. I was born and brought up in a small town in England, a town of about 25,000 people. Small enough for most people to know one another, large enough for there to be many very organizations, voluntary organizations and institutions which enabled one to come into contact with many, many different views. My father was a grocer. He had left school years before at the age of 14. He was highly intelligent, but his family in those days, in the last century, couldn't have afforded for him to go on to higher education. My friends, many of us take that, including myself, for granted, but it was denied to previous generations. And so he left school, was apprenticed to a grocer's shop. He never really liked working for other people, so eventually he started up in business on his own. My mother also had her own business. She was a dressmaker. So we were fiercely individualistic people, believing that we liked to have something which we could help to grow by our own efforts. And we were fiercely hard-working people. Both of my parents were very great Christians. They believed in God. They believed in worshiping. They were prominent members of the church. And also, they knew full well that the value of a society is the value of its citizens and how much you do, not because you have to or are employed to do, but how much voluntary work in voluntary organizations you do in addition to your own job. They were members of Rotary. You will have Rotary in Japan. It's an international organization. Its motto is service before self. They belong to many, many voluntary organizations which are a great feature of life in Britain, which help the old people, which help young children in difficulty. Because this again was part of our philosophy. As we have been fortunate to build up our own life, so we must turn around and help others who've not had the advantages that we do. We went to church every Sunday, usually twice, and frequently we had people back in the evenings, and we discussed the events of the day. I can remember, my friends, the great excitement in our house when something new was going to happen. We were going to have one of the newfangled things called a radio. Newfangled, that shows you how far back in time I go. It was quite something to have a radio in your house and therefore to be able to listen to sound broadcasts. It happened when I was about 10. And of course, it brought a new dimension to our house because radio, believe me, is very much more serious often than television, or it was in those days. We had all of the greatest people talking on radio. We had them giving their views. They might have been great academics, great philosophers, people who had done well, talks, discussions, what were called brains trust. And it opened up a new dimension for us. I was a very ordinary schoolgirl. I had one elder sister 4 years older than me. We were brought up to work extremely hard. We were brought up in the Christian faith. We were brought up in the idea that if you're in a small town, you belong to many different organizations. It may be a local orchestra. It may be amateur dramatics. It may be a debating society. But the essence of a small town is all of these interesting organizations. It may be all your small business people gathered together. It may be that now and then we would have someone called a member of parliament down from London, which was 150 miles away, to talk to us. This was the background. My friends, it was a very good background. We were taught the importance of principles, we were taught the importance of honor, we were taught the importance of duty. My father was a local councillor, an elected local councillor. Because he actually was highly intelligent, he very soon became chairman of the finance committee of our local town. And I must tell you that in our local town, with my father as chairman and in charge of finance, as a voluntary effort, we never had a deficit. That was a very good lesson for me to learn before I went into politics. We also believed, because we were members of Rotary, which is an international organization, that we had international obligations. Yes, we had obligations to our small town, had the obligations of patriotism to our country, but we also had international obligations. And I remember at my school, both my sister and I were encouraged to have pen friends in other countries. And there was an organization for doing this. I had a French pen friend who lived in Paris. My sister had an Austrian or German girlfriend who lived in Vienna. And we corresponded, half our letter in our own language and the other half in either the French or German, which we were taught at school. We were all very relieved when we'd done the bit in French or German and could write the rest of the letter in English. And then, my friends, all of a sudden, it was the mid to late 1930s. My father had a letter from the father of my sister's pen friend, a letter in German translated into English. It was in 1938. It seems a long time to you, but is as vivid in my recollection as eventually this year will be in yours when you're very much older. It portrayed events that had happened in Europe. We were very much aware that a man called Hitler, a dictator called Hitler, had taken charge in Germany, that he had stopped all voluntary organizations like Rotary. There's no such thing as voluntary organizations, or equal discussion, or free discussion. This was the new, ruthless dictator. And he had marched into Austria, into Vienna. And that was where my sister's pen friend lived. Her father had seen what was happening. How could he give his only daughter a better future? He was a bank manager, he couldn't leave. And so he wrote to my father, asking, please, if I can get my daughter out to the home of your daughter, would you take her until we can make other arrangements for her? And it was my father's unhesitating decision to write back and say, yes, of course we can. We'd be proud to do so. And all my political life, I have known and understood all that is best, most honorable, and most decent in citizens of comparatively small towns when faced with something in international life which is fundamentally wrong. What Hitler was doing was wrong. What could we do to help the next generation? And so Edith came, Edith Milpure. She stayed with us, and this marvelous Rotary movement, gradually she went around many of our friends and stayed with us until eventually she left to go to relatives in South America. And from what we knew afterwards of the concentration camps in Austria, we had the great joy of knowing that at least our small effort had helped to save one person from the tyranny that was there. I tell you this so that you can understand, even though it was a small town, 25,000, there were people, and there are people everywhere in the world who are honorable and true. It's part of our religion. Whatsoever is honorable, whatsoever is true, whatsoever is good report, think and act on these things. And it is because there are so many people that believe in that liberty and justice and honor survive and gradually are pervading the rest of the world. Now, that was the background in which I was brought up. I went to school, obviously. I was quite bright, though I say it myself. It wasn't me, it's because of the inheritance of my father. We were always brought up to read. I'm afraid there's not such a lot of reading these days. Reading was the path in those days to learning more. And every Saturday morning, I went from our home, which was above the shop, we lived above the shop, to the local public library to borrow 2 books. And it so happened my father was on the local council, and as well as being chairman of the finance committee, he was chairman of the library committee. So my instructions to the librarian were, please, I want the latest book about current events the world over. And so we did. And also I wanted the latest book either about the arts or the music, because we were an artistic and a musical family, and also about the other things, less political things. These 2 books came home every Saturday, and we read them, and we talked about them, and they went back in the next. Reading, there's no substitute for it. Reading and studying is so very much better, so very much deeper than watching television. Actually, listening to radio was very much deeper than watching television. Television tends to be sound bites, and you take a view without going into it deeply. And so we were always brought up to do these things deeply And frequently, when we went to church on Sunday morning and Sunday evening, if there was ever a stranger in our church who'd come from somewhere else, in wartime, if there were ever any servicemen there who hadn't anywhere to go in the evening, they came back to our home. This was very British. Now, I had a great ambition. I listened very much to the conversation of the adults, and I decided that I wanted to go on to some higher learning. And so I had an ambition to go to university, and I wanted to go to one of the two great universities, Oxford or Cambridge. Now, that wasn't easy. We could do it by winning scholarships. At that time, even though if you wanted to read a scientific subject, which I did, I wanted to read chemistry and physical chemistry because I happened to be very good at it. You had also to have a qualification in a language, which for us was French, and also in an ancient language, which for us was Latin, from which so many of the European languages are derived. And so we'd had no Latin taught in our school. And unless I could pass the exam in Latin, I wasn't going to be able to go to Oxford, even though the subject I wanted to pursue was chemistry. And so I had private lessons with a head teacher of the boys' school. He was a Latin master. I worked at my Latin, and in 6 months I had managed to pass the Latin exam. So eventually I got to Oxford. And this was a very great thing. In our family, only one other person, and he was my cousin, had ever been to university. He's a little bit older than me. He chose economics. I, at that stage, you know, when you're 17 or 18, you know all the answers. I, at that stage, thought economics really was rather more common sense than anything else. And so I was going to read a scientific subject. I was lucky. I served under a wonderful person as tutor. And don't forget, as I say to you, the thing which has influenced this century more than anything else has been the colossal advances in science. Whether it being in physics, you have a great Nobel Prize winner, Mr. Leo Esaki, Professor Leo Esaki, a Nobel Prize winner in physics. My tutor, to whom I went to in Oxford, was a Nobel Prize winner in the structure, the chemical structure, X-ray crystallography of matter, and actually was instrumental in getting out the structure of the very first antibiotic to be created, which was created in my time, called penicillin. It's very interesting that one came absolutely into contact with these fantastic Nobel Prize winners, and as you have this great pride of yours. And so I went to Oxford, but I never gave up my interest in politics. And so in my spare time, there wasn't very much spare time if you're reading a scientific subject, because you have to do both the theory and the practice in laboratories. In my spare time, I was always passionately interested in politics. We'd always talked and debated these things at home. So I was very quickly talking and debating these things in Oxford University. The war came to an end, which was a great relief. And then one had to decide, as my period was coming to an end, what to do. I took a job in research chemistry and still had this passionate interest in politics. I could never have thought of becoming even a member of parliament, an ordinary member of parliament. There are about 650 of them. I couldn't have thought about it, because in those days, members of parliament were not full-time, and they were paid only a small allowance, and I would always have had to earn my own living. However, as you know, in the post-war period, everything changed. It changed in your country, it changed in ours. Everything changed. And members of parliament began to be paid a reasonable salary and expected also to have another job as well. And so, with great I think, ambition, perhaps a little bit of cheek, I decided that I would try to become adopted in order to become a member of parliament. Now, in our country, members of parliament represent an area, and you have to be adopted to represent that area either for a conservative cause or for a Labour cause. We were conservative, and to my utter amazement, I was adopted at the age of 23 for a very difficult seat, a very industrial seat. I didn't win it, but I learned a very great deal in trying for that seat. There, sorry, it's very dry here, very dry. You're finding the same difficulty, and you haven't got water to drink. In that seat, I had a scientific job, and there I met my husband, who also had a business in paint and chemicals, or preservative chemicals. Having lost the election, eventually I married instead. 2 years later, I had twins, which I thought was a very quick way of acquiring a family. And it was a boy and a girl. I think the good Lord was very good to me. And so, after about 6 years, then I thought, is it possible to come back into politics? It was because I was adopted for a seat, a parliamentary seat in London. My husband's firm was in London, our house was in London, Parliament was in London, my own seat was in London. And so everything went well for me, and I became a member of Parliament. I was a very modest member of Parliament. I knew that it's best not to speak until you have really got something to say. A lot of people speak regardless of whether they really have got a message to give or otherwise. And so I rarely made speeches, but when I did, they took the headlines. Very soon, my own party decided they ought to have more women in power, in position of power, and so I was promoted to be a junior minister. And promoted because they always put women into welfare jobs. We were never thought to be able to do industrial jobs or financial jobs. So I was put into a welfare department, which was a very good thing, because one learned a very great deal about the hardships which some people suffer, and were able to try to relieve them and set up a social security system which would help everyone. After that, we went out of office. When we came back in again and won the next election, the head of my party made me the minister, cabinet status, for science, at which I was good, and education, which I had been through. And so for 4 years, I learned to be a cabinet minister. I learned to answer debates in the House. I was quite a good debater. And I learned to answer questions in the House, because in our system, each minister has to stand up in the House of Commons according to a timetable, and you have to be there, and if you're in charge of a particular department, I was education and science, I would answer questions for 3/4 of an hour. The questions would be put on an order paper, so I knew what the first question was. But any member who got up to ask it could ask another question and then a second question, and you didn't know quite what it was going to be. Later, when I became Prime Minister, which was a great surprise to me, later when I became Prime Minister, I had to answer questions on each and every department, and I had no idea what the questions were going to be. Because the question on the order paper was, the Prime Minister, please give details of her engagements today. So I got up and said, yes, I've got 6 things to do, these are they. And then the next question, because everyone with a question on the order paper had the right to ask another question. The next question was, would the Prime Minister in her busy day have time to look at? And it could have been anything. Something with industry, something with the arts, something with education, something with the health service, something with social security. My friends, I have learned that whatever you're going to do in life, whatever your job, make very careful and detailed preparation before you go to give a speech, before you go to do a public occasion. Whatever you do, prepare your life well for it, prepare your answers. And when I first started to do that as Prime Minister, I became Prime Minister in 1979. I answered every Tuesday and Thursday. And over the weekend before, I would spend about 8 hours in preparation, getting information from each and every department, from each and every minister. What are the current problems? What are the questions they're likely to want to trip me up on? 8 hours. But I was only on for 20 minutes questions each day. That was the extent. And I must say, I think they never tripped me up. I was able to do it in the end by about 4 hours because your knowledge is cumulative. And I was the first woman Prime Minister. I suppose, my friends, I was lucky to come and be in politics at a time when people began to realize that women, although they played a fantastic role in the life of the nation, had also, as in the same as your country, played a fantastic role in wartime, were not fully represented in Parliament. And so they were looking for able people to do it, and I happened to be around at that time. I loved the work. I had a passion for politics. I had a passion for history. I had a passion for building a better future. Now, my friends, we're fortunate. For the last 50 years, there have been no major conflicts, no world wars. 50 years. Just contrast the first 50 years of this century. 2 world wars. Terrible death rates in battle. And so our first task is to try to see that this period of the greater peace continues. There have, of course, been many, many local conflicts. There was one when Saddam Hussein tried to invade Kuwait, and George Bush and I threw him out. There have been others in Vietnam. There have, in fact, my friends, been about 120 local conflicts. And if ever you're in a position of power in your own country, you always have to see that should the unexpected happen, should someone else be building up a very considerable armies, very considerable missiles, and these days you can buy missiles from North Korea easily, you can buy nuclear material from there. These things are happening, and evil will always be with us. And if you're in positions of power, you know full well that you must always have a policy to counter the unexpected. Thatcher's law of politics is the unexpected happens. And when it does, you better be prepared for it. And that's why, my friends, you're ratepayers and taxpayers. It's why that your politicians, and certainly when I was in office, and I was in office with the great Reagan, Ronald Reagan, had a very similar background to myself and had the same passion for liberty and law and democracy as I did. And we said we must always be ready to defend it wherever it's attacked in the world. And because we knew that dictators like Hitler, like Saddam Hussein, like Mao and Stalin, because we always knew that dictators built up their weapons and armaments before they built up a standard of living. We said we have to have enough. But there's something in a free society in the West, and you're part of the West, that enables you to do research and technology, that enables you to, there's something about the air of freedom which gets your imagination going, which gets your inspiration going, which enables you to make the great steps forward in science, often faster than they do in a dictatorial country. And so, you put a great deal into science. You put a great deal into the freedom of those people. I used to watch it with my own tutor. You can go so far with logic. You learn logic. That's how science is done, by logic. That's how your mathematics is done, by logic. Then there comes a stage, and it's in politics too, when you can't get any further with logic, you can't get any further with learning the lessons of history. And at that stage, the future depends on those people who can make a leap from logic by inspiration to an idea, a substance, a process that's never been thought of before. Such, for example, was what happened with my tutor, Dorothy Hodgkin. We had a new antibiotic called penicillin. We wanted to know whether we could synthesize it chemically to get more penicillin. For that, we had to get out the structure of it. All the experiments were done on structure. The substance responded to no known structure at all. You'd got as far with experiment and logic as you could. And then, and it's the same with your great physics Nobel Prize winner, it is some people, they're called geniuses. It may be in music, it may be in the arts, it may be in science, it may be in maths. They can leap forward to something that's never been thought of before. It's inspiration. It just comes. It's a marvelous thing about the human brain. And my tutor had it, and so we got out the structure of penicillin. And these tremendous advances have been made in this during our time. They tend to come more quickly in a free society, which of course is why most of your Nobel Prize winners do come from free societies. We take freedom for granted. Perhaps we shouldn't. Well, now, all of these things were very much a part of my life, and I'm still not quite sure how it happened. But then I became Prime Minister. My father had died at that time. He had been there when I was first given my first job, and he would have been so proud. And the same thing will happen with you as you get on in life. But never, never, never forget, the essence of a good society is the family. The essence of a good society is the good that individuals will do. And through the whole of my life, until very recently, there has been a kind of battle of ideas in the world between those in the communist or dictatorial countries who had no freedom or liberty whatsoever, but were told what to do. That was the whole of the Soviet Union, the whole of China, and others, their surrogates elsewhere. And the way of life that we fought for in Britain, liberty, it's a tripod. Liberty, you can't have liberty without a rule of law. Eventually your rule of law must be made by democracy. No such thing of one of those without the others. Liberty, a rule of law, and without democracy. And this is indeed the message which we have been brought up with. Now the personalities. We had to tackle and see off the communist countries because their people had no way of life. And we saw the poverty in both the material ways and in the more valuable ways when it collapsed. And the greatest battle that was fought this century haven't been the battles fought by war. They were the battles which were won without a shot being fired by the firmness of the West, the superiority of our way of life, the fact that eventually the communist countries could not keep out the message of liberty and the life that it led. And so indeed, Ronald Reagan was one of the great people in my time. During the battles of war, perhaps one of the greatest people of all was Winston Churchill, our Prime Minister, who had a remarkable time. He was never very good at school. Don't worry if you're not very good at school. He was a master of the English language. He read and read and read. And he was a genius at understanding human nature. He had fought himself during the battles at the beginning of the century. He was First Lord of the Admiralty, that is in charge of all our naval things in the First War. He was the most brilliant speaker I have ever heard. He knew the English language, he knew how to use it. At a great time of darkness in our country, he would say, never in the history of human conflict has so much been owed by so many, by so few. And that was a reference to the Second World War, when everyone on the mainland continent of Europe had been defeated, and we were standing alone, and all we had to defeat the German Air Force was 500 pilots, and some Polish ones who had managed to escape. London was bombed for 3 months. Those 500 pilots went up day and night. We never knew how they did it. But eventually they convinced Hitler that there was something in Britain which was invincible. And of course, Winston expressed it. Never in the history of human conflict has so much been owed by so many, our whole country, 55 million, to so few. He was quite remarkable. He was a great friend of Roosevelt and also later of Truman. And the two got together because, you know, you have to have some hope. However difficult things are, you almost must give some hope to your people. What hope had we? It was before America came into the war, and later she did. And these two great statesmen, Roosevelt and Churchill, met in the middle of the Atlantic on a ship to which they were flown. And they pronounced something called the Atlantic Charter, which should be the right of all peoples everywhere. Freedom of worship was the first freedom, to worship according to your religion or your belief. Freedom of speech, absolutely vital. Those were the two freedoms of, the positive freedoms, and freedom from fear. Your country should always be ready to defend you. Must always keep her defenses up to date. And freedom from want, that we in the world must help those who are suffering from poverty. And this came at the deepest parts of the war. And then since, mercifully, we've had the United Nations. My friends, let me say this. I saw Mr. Kofi Annan go to Iraq, etc. But my friends, nice words will never defeat tyrants. If they could, Saddam Hussein would never have marched into Kuwait. You must always keep your defenses strong. But with your defenses strong, you must always keep your philosophy, your way of life bright and shining, and teach it to future generations. And with the aid of radio and television that we have now, our great hope is that we can spread the message of liberty and law and democracy to the rest of the world. It's a big task for your generation, because fewer than 1/2 of the countries of the world are democracies. We have many very great leaders, from people like Nelson Mandela to many other very great leaders at the present time. You can't do without leaders. We have many great international organizations. The first one that I ever took part in was the G7 when I came, the first international organization when I came to Japan and started to be one of the people who can influence the future. In the end, the quality, the standard of living depends upon the integrity, the honor, the kindliness, and the decency of each and every man and woman. That is the message. Thank you so very much.
At this time, we would like to open the floor to some questions from the audience. The first question will be from Ms. Akiko Yoneyama. Will you please state your question?
Thank you very much, Lady Thatcher. I enjoyed very much reading your autobiography, The Path to Power, because it's all about leadership and how you made your decisions according to your own philosophy. What are your fundamental principles when you make important decisions?
Well, some decisions are between right and wrong. Those are easy because there's a sense in every person which knows what is right and what is wrong. There are another set of decisions which really depend upon priorities and your priorities for expenditure. For example, there'll be enormous demands for increases in pensions, particularly as we have an older and older population, enormous demands for increases in health care, enormous demands perhaps for increases in police to deal with criminal care. So first you have to decide your priorities. The first duty of a government is to protect its law-abiding citizens. So you must never let either your overseas defense or your internal defense and a strong police force, you must never let those go down. Then the question is, how much do you expect the state to provide what are called free health services and free pensions, because they're all paid for by the taxpayer. And most of us these days have tried to have a basic pension paid for by the state and through the taxpayer, and a basic health. But in addition to that, to say that people must provide from it for their own expenditure. And there are always demands, and frequently in the House of Commons, the Prime Minister, will you please spend more on so-and-so? And I would say, look, it's not a question of asking me to spend more. It's a question of how much you, as your Member of Parliament, are telling your own supporters they have got to provide for the government to spend. And this is a very great intellectual and human problem in Japan and in America. You take far smaller proportion of the income of all your people for government to spend than anyone else. You're somewhere between 33 and 35%, Japan and America. Britain comes next with about 41%. Mainland Europe is about 50%, which is too much. So you get a great philosophical problem. Surely, aren't we going to say that by the time everyone has got a reasonable job, a reasonable place to live, that they really should be able to look after their families, provided always that there's free access to education and free access to everything for the poor. And that is how you do it. I managed to get the percentage of our expenditure down very considerably. Because the more government spends, the higher the taxes are. Now, I'll give you an example. When I became Prime Minister, the top rate of tax on earned income was 83%. So our very able people, our scientists, our managers, our entrepreneurs, were going overseas. But the top rate of tax was less. The top rate of tax on investment income was 98%. So there wasn't the incentive. But if you're in politics, you must give incentives to people to make extra effort. Now, I got both of those down fairly quickly in the first 2 years, and after 3 years, had them both down to top rate of tax was 40% on earned income and 40% on investment income, and you didn't reach the top rate for quite a long time. But those are the figures, but you can see the difference in approach. A socialist government took more and more from the people to give more and more power to government. I took less and less from the people to give more and more power back to the people to manage their own lives. And so, this is the fundamental principle in a free society. Your job is to run the government, taking only what is reasonable to take, but not too much from people, having a sound rule of law, and a very good, moderate police force to see that the criminals were apprehended, and that they were given a free trial, and that the decision was made by the courts of law. So it's what is right, and also what is an incentive to create in the end a better, freer, and more prosperous society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
The next question is from Ms. Sachiko Manome. Ms. Manome, please.
You must have met many world leaders in your life. Who was the most interesting or impressive person to you, and why?
You're asking me to be very undiplomatic. Obviously, the people whom you work with best are the people who have the same approach to government as we do. That is to say, government should be limited and leave the maximum powers to the people. Or the other way of life, which was communism and fascism, which government takes all powers to itself. There's no rule of law, and you can be cast quickly into prison and never seen again. Now that's a very extreme position, but it was the position which prevailed when I first came into politics with your Stalins and of course with your Maos. Don't forget, the whole of China and the whole of the Soviet Union was under communism, and a lot of other places beside. And sometimes the people you know as leaders are often the bad men. Hitler's very well known. Mao was very well known. Stalin was very well known. They had no respect for human life. And in fact, in this century, more people have lost their lives by dictators' ruthlessness than have lost their lives in battles for freedom. So Ronald Reagan and I worked extremely well together. He was very good. Truman was a very good president of the United States. He had tons of guts. Mr. Nakasone, we worked very well with. He had the good fortune to be your prime minister for longer than usually happens. So we knew him, able to work with him. And just remember that when you turn them out with astonishing rapidity. Mr. Nakasone was there for 4 years. And we knew him, and were able to talk freely with him. It was a very good and profitable time. We owe a great deal in the ex-communist countries to the people who've had the courage to look around the world and say, liberty is providing a better quality of life and a better standard of living than the dictatorship of communism or fascism. Now, those were Mr. Gorbachev in the Soviet Union was the first person who came to power in the Soviet Union to say, you can have freedom of speech, you can actually have freedom of worship. Religion had been prohibited since 1917 in the Soviet Union, but you couldn't extinguish the faith of the people. He said, right, you can go back into the churches and worship. You have freedom of speech. You can have freedom to see what the Supreme Soviet was doing. And we have a saying in politics, the longest journey starts with the first steps. It was Mr. Gorbachev that introduced that, and for which we must ever be grateful to him. Why then didn't he continue? Well, for a very simple reason. He was down in the Crimea, which is the home of some of the presidents of the Soviet Union, on holiday. When the Soviet Union, there was a rebellion, and the Soviet Union actually broke up. People were wanting to secede. Russia, as you know, is the largest state in the Soviet Union. There are 14 others all around the border. It was breaking up. And when Mr. Gorbachev came back, it had broken up. And I remember watching on the plane him coming back and thinking, now there are going to be problems, because his job had gone. There wasn't a Soviet Union to be president of, but there was still Russia, and it had been some previous months since Mr. Yeltsin whom I had not known, had come to see me in London. And I said to him, look, I'm a friend of Mr. Gorbachev. He said, look, I'm an admirer of Mr. Gorbachev, but he is not elected. He was appointed by the Supreme Soviet. And he said, I want to try to be the first elected president of Russia, which was the biggest state. He said, I'm going to create an election and I'm going to put up to be elected. And so Mr. Yeltsin was the first person who risked his reputation against others and was in fact elected. And he also is a very good leader. But Mr. Gorbachev started it. Mr. Yeltsin created the first democracy. They haven't yet come through to prosperity or to the full extent of quality of life you'd expect in a democracy. Because you can't take a people who for years, ever since 1917, have been told they can't make any decisions over their own life. They're told what school to go to, they're told what job they must have, they're told where they must live, they're told how much they have. You can't suddenly say to them, no, you must take responsibility for finding your own job, deciding your own future, finding your own house. You can't. They're afraid. They've no experience of taking decisions. And that's why they're having such great difficulty in the Soviet Union now. And what happens then, and if they haven't a rule of law, you see, in a communist society or dictatorship, you have a police state. You can drag anyone off the streets and they disappear, probably into a concentration camp, because there's no rule of law. So the greatest defender of liberty is a rule of law in independent courts, with a right to be heard and to be represented by a lawyer. They weren't ready for that in Russia, and gradually they're getting ready for it. But it has gone from a rigid dictatorship to something of a chaos. And frankly, when I watch the news, I don't understand how those coal miners work in the Soviet Union when they have not been paid for 3 years. And what they have to do is take what they can get, take anything, and in other factories in the Soviet, they take what they make and they try to sell it. Or they grow things and they try to sell that. And it's going to be quite a time until they come to an ordered and orderly society. And in that time, we must have every sympathy and give every help we can to the Soviet Union. Now, so Mr. Yeltsin is a very, very impressive person. He leads in a way you couldn't if you had a full democracy. They haven't got a full democracy. And the Russians like a sort of explosive and strong personality. And I think we're fortunate that he is there. There are 1 or 2 youngsters whom I know who are coming up. The young man called Nemtsov. There's a new prime minister who's only 35. There's a Nemtsov who is 38, who's governor of one of the provinces. And introduced free enterprise into that province. And there's a story in a big collective farm in that province where the people in the farm wanted not to be a big collective, but wanted each their own patch of land. And the government then said no. Nemtsov said yes, and the World Bank made out a plan. There were 2,000 people in that collective. 200 wanted to go independent. And the World Bank made out a plan and allocated a piece of land to the 200 who wanted to go independent. And all the pieces were next to one another and on the eastern part, so it was a whole block. And they started up on their own, on the auspices of the World Bank, and within 2 years, this group of people, each owning their own plot of land, produces 3 times as much agricultural produce as the rest of the collective in comparison with what the collective can do. 3 times as much by having the inspiration and incentive to work together. Now, how do we get to this? Who's an impressive leader? Well, I don't know who's going to come after. Mr. Yeltsin, but I do know there are several very able people, of whom Mr. Nemtsov is one. Over in China, it was Deng Xiaoping, who you know, who first observed in the rest of the world that those who had economic liberty, free enterprise as we call it, produced far more than those who had no liberty at all. And it was he who said, right, if you produce extra, you can sell it yourself. You can start up on your own, you can sell it yourself. So he started the economic path to liberty. Mr. Zhu Rongji, whom I know, I've been twice to see in China, he came to London recently, is concerned to see if he can get privatization. Everything is nationalized in China. They've got about 3 times as many people working in the nationalized industries as they should, and so they're overmanned. And he said, how am I going to privatize? And I said, well, you'll get quite a lot of money when you privatize an industry. Out of that money, give compensation for those who have to leave it. And knowing how adventurous and entrepreneurial the Chinese people are, they'll start up on their own. So we're starting these with people who have seen how the free way of life works. And it's certainly happened in Russia. It's happening also in China. With Zhu Rongji is a very good person at present, and it was Deng Xiaoping who started it. In India, it was Mrs. Gandhi, who was so tragically killed. And we do owe quite a considerable amount to these leaders who, by their determination, managed to change things for the future. I won't be so bold as to pick out leaders in Japan, but I do say that Mr. Nakasone, who was there for 4 years, was a very good leader. Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now, we've got to get on, otherwise we shan't... I'll give shorter answers. Now, who's third?
The next question is Miss Haruko Kaneko.
Yes, now, where do I look?
Miss Kaneko, please.
Yes, fine.
Yes, my question is about economy. The financial reform, so-called Big Bang, just started this April in Japan to catch up with world financial standards. Well, however, the general economic climate in Japan is still very bad. Do you have any suggestions on this issue as the pioneer of Big Bang in the United Kingdom in the 1980s?
Now, first let me say, the word Big Bang is being totally wrongly used. Big Bang was the creation of the world out of chaos. God created the world. Well, now, we're not quite up to that level, so we've no right to use the word Big Bang. And it isn't. It's a change of policy. Now, certainly, the change of policy was from the total control of government over people to government serving the rights and liberties of the people. And that is the change. And I would be very careful about not using the word Big Bang, but certainly we did make the change. Now, the question really is, let me put it in a different way. People in Japan are very talented. They're very able. They're very skilled. They're very good at organization. They're very hardworking. People in America are very talented, they're very skilled, they're very innovative, they're very hardworking. You're also very good at design. You've got all of the same qualities. You live in the same world. Why is it that America has had 7 years of steady increasing economic growth, and Japan has had 7 years of considerable difficulty? I'll tell you why I think it is. There's a third thing. It's not only the talents and abilities of people, they're very similar. It is the framework of law and economy in which they work. America and Britain has a total structure of a free society. A sound economy, you have a sound economy, you've got that. A sound rule of law. No corruption. A sound rule of law on banks. A sound rule of law on institutions. So in our countries, Your banks couldn't possibly go on making loan after loan after loan, far greater than it's wise to make, and not calling them in. We have a law with regard to how our institutions are conducted. It is under the supervision of a Securities and Investment Board. So if they see difficulties arising, they're onto them immediately before we get into trouble. Now this, I come to the conclusion, is the difference. We've only ever had one bank go wrong, and that was Barings, and that was a matter of fraud, and it was not a deposit-taking bank, it was a merchant bank. You cannot have the institutions of the economy not properly supervised, not under a clear rule of law, what we call transparent. You can soon see if they're lending too much. Now that, I believe, is the difference. And it is one of the things you'll have to do. We have a semi-independent central bank, so does the United States, but Alan Greenspan, the greatest central banker in the world, is called before Congress to be questioned 2 or 3 times a year. Ours will be called before our Parliament to be questioned 2 and 3 times a year. They are under the overarching supervision of the Securities and Investment Board. And I think you'll find it's because you are lacking this rule of law with fundamental institutions that you have got the problem, and it certainly is so. In the rest of Asia, they're lacking that rule of law, and in the rest of Asia, they've got corruption. Corruption is a negation of law, and it has to be stopped. Corruption is a criminal offense. It has to be brought before the courts. Every single person has to be treated the same way if you apply for a loan from a bank. Every company has to be treated in the same way. Would you be a sound person to lend to? Not whether you're a friend of the managing director or a crony of someone. Would you be sound? That's the last step, I think, which has to be completed in the rest of Asia. That is why I think your Thailand went bust, or Indonesia went bust. It's corruption. And it's tragic. I was amazed that Korea went bust because, but Korea has a different reason. She's got very big conglomerates, not many individual groups that stand on their own feet, and they're all linked together. And I think we've learned a lesson. There's no substitute for an honorable rule of law under a legal general supervision. Thank you for asking the question.
Thank you very much.
The next question is from Mr. Takeshi Matsuda. Mr. Matsuda, please.
It is very difficult for women to be hard workers and good mothers at the same time. In fact, my wife has been struggling with this. How have you got over this difficulty?
Well, I tried to explain during my speech that I was lucky. Certainly I had twins at one go, which was very good. But also, my husband's job was in London. We lived in London. My work was in London. But even so, I could not have done it unless I had earned enough myself to have extremely good, qualified help when I was not there to look after the children. But equally, I could get back to the children every evening before they went to bed, which is very important. I was up with them in the morning before they went to school, and there at weekends. You do have to work extremely hard. But as a man, I'm sure you'll know that on the whole, women do work harder than men when they have a job and have the house to run as well. But we're very good managers, you know. So it can be done, but it can't be done if you have to travel a long way to work away from home. Always, I could have got back home within 20 minutes if there was any crisis. that went on at home, I always had competent help. It can be done, for example, if you live over the shop, because there are always other people about that can help with the children. But I do say that the children must come first. But as they grow older, you can, in fact, take up your own work again, and the thing is to keep in touch with it the whole time. It can be done. It means very hard work. It means a very fulfilling life. And just supposing my constituency had been in the north of Scotland, I couldn't have done it, and I couldn't have taken it. But life bounced right for me. And you'll find more and more women are working, probably taking later when their children have left school. And it's necessary then to keep up your skills. And they find it very rewarding. I found it very rewarding. And I found my children didn't suffer. Indeed, they all often met people whom they would never have met otherwise. Good organization, good management, and all living closely within the same area as work and home. Thank you very much.
The next question is from Ms. Tomomi Kato. Ms. Kato, please.
It has been almost a year since Hong Kong reverted to Chinese rule. Do you think the one country, two system arrangement is working? And will it continue to work?
Well, now, I had to negotiate the future of Hong Kong with Deng Xiaoping when I was Prime Minister. And the reason I had to negotiate was because we held 93% of the land on which Hong Kong stands under a lease from China. 7% was freehold. Hong Kong Island was ours. But 93% of the land was held on lease, which ended June the 30th last year. And so I negotiated with Deng Xiaoping, who realized that the system we had in Hong Kong, the political system, was far more fruitful and far more beneficial the political system they had just over the land border in China. Same people, same Chinese people, they earned in Hong Kong an average income per year of $25,000. Same people, mainland China, earned on average each year $800. What's the difference? Same people, same hard work. The difference is the political system under which they live. The liberty which gives free enterprise, which enabled the people of Hong Kong to work so very hard. The absence of liberty in China at that time, which meant their talents and abilities could not express themselves. Now, Deng Xiaoping was the first person who understood this, and so we had to negotiate with him that the way of life which we British had created in Hong Kong would continue for 50 years after we had left. And I said to him, why 50 years? I'd like 100. And he said to me, because I believe that with the reforms that I'm introducing in China, China within 50 years will have caught up. And I refrain from saying it's not only the economic reforms, but it's the political reforms that matter. But normally that comes afterwards. So at the moment, what's hit Hong Kong now? It's not a collapse of Hong Kong. What has hit Hong Kong and hit you and hit other people is in fact the collapse of the system in Thailand, in Indonesia. In other words, the corruption of some of the countries. And corruption is death to law. And also the failure to have a proper framework of finance and law in your financial and legal systems. And so, when you get corruption, the big bosses take over, law goes out of the window, no one gets their rightful dues as they should. And so that, in fact, has spread. As you know, Thailand, it is now it didn't affect the people like Malaysia and Singapore and Taiwan, because they had a full system of a rule of law, a sound financial system, and sound banks. So they didn't collapse. But everyone is affected in a secondary way by the collapse of other big countries, because the trade collapses. So Hong Kong hasn't the trade from the rest that it had. Singapore hasn't the trade from the rest that it had. Indonesia has collapsed again through corruption, as you know. If only each of those countries had had a rule of law of the kind we gave to Singapore and Hong Kong, if only they'd had such marvelous leaders as Harry Lee Kuan Yew, who was really one of my pin-up boys. He's a marvelous leader. I used to say to him, it's a pity you didn't stay in China. Your parents didn't stay in China. If you had stayed in China, Harry Lee, I said, China would be the most prosperous country in the world now. You'd have got it right. But Hong Kong, Singapore, as it is very prosperous. So the countries that had the honorable economic system, honorable legal system, are still prospering, but are affected by a knock-on effect. And the others are in real difficulty. And the only thing is to get a totally honorable system. The IMF is trying its level best. I thought myself that the IMF conditions were a bit too tough on Indonesia too quickly. It was if they said, look, you're running your prices too low, you've got to put them up by 70%, and you've got to put various others up by 60%. It was too quick. And if it's too quick, people can't take it, and they rebel. Had they said, take it slowly, and take it in easy steps, then it would have been all right. But you cannot do again without a rule of law independently administered. And that, of course, is the greatest, I think, gift of the Western people to the world. Now, Hong Kong still has its rule of law. It still has its currency board. And in spite of all of the efforts of some people to break the Hong Kong link with the dollar, they haven't succeeded. And that says a great deal for the administration of Hong Kong, which withstood all this. Perhaps it's a pity we British didn't govern China as well. It would have been better. But I hope that Hong Kong prevails. I hope that Singapore prevails. I hope that Taiwan is all right. All of these countries that are well run are struggling, but I hope they'll act as a kind of locomotive to pull the others out. But I add this: Asia cannot recover without the leadership of Japan. It really can't. You're doing a little bit more about making all of your systems transparent. If those countries I've mentioned and Japan have got to act as a locomotive with the right framework of law within which enterprise can flourish to pull the others out. And the only lack in this part of the world is that systematic, correct framework of law. Otherwise, you have everything. Good people, hard work, loyalty, and you have, I believe, a very great future as soon as you've got this immediate problem solved. A very great future indeed, all of you. So cheer up. Right.
The last question
Number 6
is from Ms. Atsuko Saito. Ms. Saito, please.
Lady Thatcher, you look very healthy and active.
Thank you. I agree. Go on.
Do you do anything in particular to keep up your health? Do you do any exercise or eat anything special?
Now I'm becoming a dietary expert. The great thing is, if you want to keep your figure, is not to eat too much. appetite comes with eating. So you keep your appetite down. I used to be rather larger than I am now, so I kept my appetite down. The second thing is, don't eat fats, they're not good for you. Proteins, fresh vegetables, fresh fruit. Gets a bit dull sometimes, but it's quite good. It's much better for you. And I have a very light breakfast. I have a very, because I'm at work at lunch, I have a very light lunch, nothing heavy. I have a theory. It's difficult for the blood to go to the brain and the stomach at the same time. And it's important when I'm at work to keep it going to the brain. And then I have a good meal in the evening. But it is the proteins, not too heavy, well cooked, a certain amount of starch, but not too much, and no fat. And I must confess, I do like a glass of whiskey now and then, in the evening, at the end of work. Whiskey and soda. Very good Scotch drink. You must try it. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
サッチャー女子の高い見識は、国際文化交流に関心を持つハローの生徒、卒業生、現職の通訳ガイド、会議通訳者、翻訳者、各界著名人など約1800名の聴衆に深い感動と感銘を与えました。講演後には恒例の歓迎レセプションが盛大に開催されました。ハローの生徒や卒業生と直接親しく話すことのできるこの機会を、サッチャー女子も毎年大変楽しみにしておいでとのことです。一方で通訳ガイド国家試験を目前に控えて日夜勉強に励むハローの生徒や、語学のプロとして活躍中のハローの卒業生にとっては、女子からいただいた温かい励ましの言葉が何よりも大きな力となりました。